In 1696, 23-year-old Peter Alekséyevich became the sole ruler of Russia. His first priority was to ensure that Russia had a powerful army. Then, in the summer of 1696, he authorized a naval assault against the Ottoman base in the city of Azoz, on the Don River. The seizure of this strategically important fortress gave the Russians access to the Black Sea. Peter, convinced that his nation needed to modernize in order to attract European investment and trade, embarked upon a policy of westernization. Academies of learning were established, and Peter insisted that those in his court dress in Western clothing. He even proposed a beard tax to encourage men to be clean-shaven. These moves were very unpopular, with many people resisting them. Peter faced growing opposition from a group known as the Streltsy. Made up of infantry troops, the Streltsy planned a coup against Peter and openly defied him. In the summer of 1698, Peter had the leaders rounded up and executed. He then had the entire Streltsy dismantled. Having thus dealt with the domestic turmoil, Peter set his sights on wresting control of the Baltic Sea from Sweden. In the resulting Battle of Narva in 1700, the outgunned and outdated Russian army was decisively beaten by the Swedes. The devastating defeat to Sweden was the catalyst for a complete rebuilding of the Russian army. Within a year, Peter's army was back in the field. They managed to seize a chunk of Swedish land in an area known as the Ingerman land. It was here that Peter the Great founded the city of St. Petersburg in 1703. 5 years later, the Swedes got their revenge with a massive assault that resulted in their victory at the Battle of Holutzin. Meanwhile, Peter was facing insurrection along the frontier regions of the empire, largely as a backlash against forced conscription. Despite these internal problems, the Russian military machine was able to deliver a decisive blow to the Swedes in 1709's Battle of Poltava. The territorial gains that resulted saw Russia gaining control over the entire expanse of the Baltic coast. Peter next launched himself into a war with the Ottoman Empire. His army ended up being completely surrounded by a Turkish army along the Pruth River. Peter was forced to sign a humiliating truce in order to save his army. In 1714, Peter renewed his war with Sweden, which waged on for several years until the Treaty of Nystad of 1721 was signed, giving Russia full control over the Baltic regions of Estonia, Latvia, and Ingria. In 1698, Peter divorced his first wife, Tsarina Eudoxia Lopukhinya, but not before she bore him an heir, named Alexei Petrovich. In 1712, the Tsar married a Polish-Lithuanian peasant woman by the name of Marta Helena Skowronska. She had, however, converted to Orthodoxy in 1705 and taken the name Catherine. When Peter's son Alexei was in his mid-20s, he was suspected of plotting against his father. Peter had him thrown in prison and sentenced him to death. Alexei died in prison. This left Peter again without an heir when he died in 1725. For 2 years, Catherine ruled through a council of court ministers. When she died in 1727, the line of succession fell to Peter's grandson, Peter II, the son of Alexei. However, the boy died of smallpox before he could even be crowned. The Supreme Privy next selected Peter's niece, Anna Courland, to serve as empress. Anna ruled for 10 years, after which the imperial crown went to her great-nephew, Ivan VI. He lasted for just 2 years before a coup replaced him with Elizabeth, the daughter of Peter the Great. She ruled for 20 years, towards the end of which the 7 Years' War was waged. Russia sided with Austria against the Prussians. Just as it seemed the Russian army was about to gain a resounding victory, however, Elizabeth died. Her successor, Peter III, snatched a political defeat from the jaws of victory by negotiating a treaty with the Prussians. This led to the outraged army to stage the officers' revolt, which resulted in Peter being replaced on the throne by his wife Catherine. Catherine was of Prussian heritage, and her marriage to Peter was a completely loveless union, designed to strengthen relations between Russia and Prussia. From the very start, they lived like strangers in the same imperial palace, with both of them having numerous affairs. When Peter became Tsar in 1762, Russia and Prussia were once again at war. However, the Russians had the upper hand, so when Peter scaled back his nation's offensive, giving Prussia a victory that should have been a defeat, many in the military were enraged. This resulted in what has come to be known as the Officers' Revolt. Even though she was of Prussian origin, Catherine was able to gain favor with the officers and the people in the overthrow of her husband. She was coronated as Empress on September 22, 1762. Almost immediately upon assuming the throne, Catherine sought to limit the power of the military, while at the same time increasing the centralized authority of the monarchy. In 1767, Catherine's Law Code Commission was established to develop a new legal code. Before it was able to do so, however, events on the international stage were to overshadow the Commission's work. Catherine became involved in the internal affairs of the Polish state in an attempt to claim some of their border territory. This led to what has become known as the War of the Bar Confederation of 1768. While the Russian military prepared to face the Poles, the Ottoman Empire launched a surprise attack on the Caucasus. As a result, Catherine declared war on the Ottoman Turks. As the Russian army marched along the Danube to face the Turks, the naval squadron was summoned from the Baltic Sea, with the mission of engaging the Ottomans from the Mediterranean side. This two-pronged battle tactic proved successful, with the Russian Navy decimating the Turkish fleet as Russian infantry marched into Ottoman territory. However, an attempt to get the Greek population under Ottoman occupation to rise up was unsuccessful. The war against the Turks continued until 1774, when a peace treaty was signed. However, peace with the Turks did not last long. A conflict broke out in the Crimea in 1783, with war being once again declared in 1787. This time, Sweden decided to take advantage of Russia's distraction by declaring war. Not long thereafter, Prussia did the same. Russia suddenly found herself surrounded by enemies. It was at this time of crisis that Empress Catherine proved to be the powerful leader that was needed. Remaining calm and calculated, she guided the Russian Navy to a swift victory over Sweden, followed by the Russian invasion of the Turkish lands along the Danube. Meanwhile, Prussia became extremely concerned with the outbreak of the French Revolution and pulled out of the conflict. By 1792, Catherine's army had forced the Turks to sue for peace. Having established herself as Catherine the Great, the Empress died from a stroke in 1796. The successor was the only son that she had with her husband Peter, Paul I. From the very start, people questioned his state of mind. One of the first things that he did as emperor was to have his father's skeleton exhumed and the remains placed upon the imperial throne. Peter's reign would be a short one, lasting from 1796 to 1801. These were, however, pivotal years as they involved the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. Under Paul, Russia joined the alliance against France, even aligning with their former enemy, the Ottoman Turks, to send a joint naval squadron to take on the French. In 1799, Paul sent a force to challenge the French in Austria and Italy, with mixed success. But then, growing frustrated at the political machinations of the European powers, Paul concluded a separate peace agreement with France. This moved the British to condemn Russia. Paul reacted to the British negativity by ordering Russian troops to invade British India. This was an impossible task, with the Russians being completely unprepared for a campaign on the Indian subcontinent. It is claimed that almost half of their horses died in the deserts of the Russian frontier before even leaving Russia. This ill-thought-out campaign turned the Russian people against Paul. On March 24, 1801, he was assassinated by a group of disgruntled military officers. Paul was followed on the throne by his son, Alexander, who had collaborated with the officers who had killed his father. However, he never thought that they would actually murder Paul and was guilt-ridden over his involvement for the rest of his life. As it was, Alexander proved to be a far more capable statesman and politician than his father. He had the ability to make his ministers believe that the policies he wanted to enact were actually their own ideas. That way, if anything went wrong, he could blame them. Alexander was also popular with the people. He was responsible for many reforms, including that of the police. In 1803, he issued an order designed to provide a path to freedom for the millions of serfs who were bonded to the landlords for whom they worked. In 1805, Napoleon once again forced Russia to align with the European powers. The Russians were decimated at the Battle of Austerlitz, but they managed to rally and take on the French once again in 1807. This was a far more closely fought encounter, but once again, the French came off victorious. The Battle of Friedland, which followed, was even worse for the Russians, with more than 20,000 troops being killed. Alexander sued for peace, resulting in the Treaty of Tilsit. One of the conditions that Napoleon insisted upon was that Russia stop trading with Britain. This, however, led to a scarcity of goods and massive inflation. With his people beginning to revolt, Alexander ignored the treaty condition and restarted trade with Britain in 1811. As a result, the French sent hundreds of thousands of troops to invade Russia.